now we move on to another speaker, Johan Lannering from SKF AB, and he will speak how to achieve a cost-effective path to net zero and his experiences with this path. And now the floor is yours, Johan. Thank you.
I mean, you can't really start anything here without starting out mentioning, the terrible war that's ongoing in the Ukraine, which I think affects us all in many dimensions. And as was also been mentioned here earlier, we also have still also facing the global pandemic, which is still not over, and of course the climate crisis, which has triggered a lot of things for all of companies. I think the only thing I can find encouraging in this is to see how people are coming together, helping out, and I think that's absolutely fundamental. When we have these terrible issues going on, we just need to work together. And as Jana from Kone was saying, they were taking on people at their homes and also, giving support to various organizations. So are we doing in SKF, and I see a lot of companies doing that, so which is encouraging. But if we move into the sustainability part and also how to address the climate crisis, I'm in a very fortunate situation in seeing the total explosion of how this is evolving. Because I work at SKF, we are working with what we call reliable rotation. It's basically providing uptime with our customers and their machinery, and we primarily do that with the help of our bearing solutions. But it means that we have products in pretty much every machine that rotates in the world, everywhere. And that really gives us the front seat in seeing how our customer requirements are changing. And that more and more focus is on uptime, on having more sustainable solutions, lasting solutions. And with this aspect of how much energy you consume and consequently how much CO2 is emitted. So I would hope to, during my short time with you, I want to share some reflections first on the strategic context, where I felt that the best comparison right now is to compare this with digitalization. I think that the customer discussions we are having are very, very similar to how they were 10 years ago on computers, basically. And you could basically jokingly say that, 10 years ago, someone would knock at the door and say, "Hey guys, here's a computer. Do you think anything will happen?" And now we have, "Hey guys, we have this climate crisis. Do you think anything will happen?" And I think absolutely everything will happen, and it will create huge opportunities if you capture it, if you really understand the strategic impact that's coming. But it will also, of course, create risks. And I think one fundamental takeaway, which we're seeing, and which I think is very important, is to have this life cycle thinking. At the end of the day, the world needs to reduce approximately 51 billion tons of CO2 equivalents from the atmosphere every year. And if you want to do that, you have to be enormously efficient. And at the end of the day, your activity must be able to be measured, which basically means that the satellites we have in the atmosphere, they should be able to measure lower CO2 or carbon emission equivalents in the atmosphere. Otherwise, we're doing book counting or bookkeeping exercises, which is not, at the end of the day, will not provide value. Then a final part I'll move into is then how does a big industrial company like SKF, we have 40,000 people, we have a turnover of slightly more than $8 billion, and our main product is produced out of steel. So how do you turn that product into net zero? So I'm going to share some reflections on this, specifically on how we need to partner together on this. And then finally, before I will show you some slides here, of course, I think it's when we are embarking on this, there's still sometimes a view that it will not come with a cost. I think a lot of the money that will be spent on this transformation will be investments, but there will also be significant costs. And I think, as was also mentioned earlier, that we have to be extremely data-driven, and we really have to create, as the Americans would say, bang for the buck in every action that we're doing. I think it was a good illustrative example looking at plastic, for instance, that sometimes if you do this life cycle assessment, plastic is actually much better than wood, even though intuitively wood would always make sense. But I think it's this knowledge that we have to build up. And looking back again at the digitalization, I think one of the most fundamental flaws that the global economy did in digitalization was that we didn't understand how much knowledge it actually takes to digitalize a company or an economy. For instance, you could ask yourself, looking back 10 years, how many people in your management teams knew how to program a computer? And I think we're having the same thing here, that it's so crucial to spread the knowledge. How do we do these things? What data do you need? What targets are realistic? Where do you create bang for the buck? What are the volumes that you will be looking for? What are the standards that we need so we can start comparing and get the market economy to work on this? Before I move into a number of slides to illustrate this journey, I also wanted to mention that, as you probably see, McKinsey came out with a report a couple of weeks ago where they tried to assess this cost, which I think is good to have at the back of your head. And it basically, they were calculating what investments that are needed to move the economy from higher emitting processes to lower emitting processes, basically changing technology, hydrogen, etc. And that's an increase every year with the $3.5 trillion US, moving that sum up to $9.2 trillion. If you're like me, those numbers will not tell you anything other than they are very, very large. But maybe I will try to illustrate this with some slides here. No. Let's see. Seems like I got some issues sharing them out for some reason. I don't know if I got totally lost in my there we are. Sorry about that. Sorry for that delay. Let's see. I hope you're seeing something. So this slide, I'm just going to go through a number of graphs here. I think this is sort of the fundamental strategic slide, and this is from Boston Consulting Group, and it basically illustrates the red trajectory, the current trajectory that shows how the emissions in the world are increasing as we speak right now. The other slides show the various scenarios and trajectories of what we actually need to reduce to achieve what the Paris Agreement initially set out, and what we understand now needs to be done. So the strategic question is, do you believe that this will happen? Because if you believe that this will happen, you realize that it will happen very, very, very quickly, and you have to take the strategic action. You also have to bear in mind what changes are happening on the market and what regulatory shifts are coming. So if we look at that from an energy point of view, because the easiest way of going net zero for a company is to electrify its operations and buy renewable electricity. And if you look at these progressions here, you will see a massive increase in the renewable energy. I've been following these slides or these prognosis for a number of years. And the interesting thing is that they're typically underestimating the need and what's required significantly. But I think what we are seeing at SKF from our customers is that any market that can electrify will electrify. And that will again increase the requirements and need for more renewable energy, and you will build more renewable energy, which in many areas drives down the cost for renewable energy, which makes it possible for more technologies to go electric. And in parallel, as you're probably all aware of, you have significant legislation coming, especially in Europe under the Green Deal. I wanted to show this because this is an early simulation we did on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, or the carbon tax. As you know, the European Union has proposed basically to say that if we increase the carbon taxes inside Europe, it shouldn't be possible to import products that are not covered by the same legislation. In that case, there will be a tax at the border. So we did a very early simulation on this, where we compared an Asian steel. This was one, in this case, from one of our Chinese suppliers, and a steel from Northern Europe. That's the green slide. And the steel from Northern Europe contains more scrap, which means that has less CO2 because you don't have to take iron ore from the ground, but you have a circular way of using full steel. Whereas the gray, which is the Asian steel, it's much more iron ore. And here you clearly see that as the cost of CO2 goes up, it really, really impacts your business if you're in steel. And I think this will spread to most other areas where you have a lot of CO2 in your footprint. Another interesting aspect was when the Commission wrote this, the first proposals, they were speculating that they might have to legislate on a CO2 price of 60 euros per ton by 2025. And as you know, the carbon price in Europe the last year has been up to 90 euros a ton already, dropping down a little bit after the crisis in the Ukraine, but still very high. I think it was close to 70 euros last time I checked. An additional graph here is SKF's journey, which is I think in many cases, very similar to many other companies that have been on this with sustainability and climate for a long time. We try to map our history in this area, and as you see, it's a bit of a hockey stick here as well. We set our first environmental policy and targets back in '89, leading up to 2000. But as you see at the end there, you have a huge drive. You know, science-based target initiative, various standards being set. Green bond, we issued a green bond of 300 billion euros, where we actually get better financing because of the way we work with climate. And this is something we're seeing that our customers are doing, and where we can feed in and work together. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, that you have to have a life cycle approach. I think that's really fundamental. It's a bit to do, as the Americans would say, you know, create bang for the buck. If I would look at a typical bearing, and I can use an example. Let's say we have a bearing that's used in a car which is run on petrol. There will be some emissions in the supply chain. That's upstream Scope 3. There will be emissions in our manufacturing, which we have decided to drive down to zero by the year 2030. Typically, you do that by electrifying, energy efficiency, and buying renewable energy. Then we have the logistics part, where we can also work with our customers to reduce that. But in the use space, that's typically where the emissions are the highest for our products. So our key focus is, of course, to work with our customers on their products and their processes. To illustrate, if you have a unplanned downtime, let's say a bearing breaks or something like that, a factory still typically consumes the same amount of energy, which just then turns into waste because you're not producing it. And if you're in a steel mill, for instance, I mean, the consequences can be really bad. That you might lose actually what you were trying to produce at that time. But if you electrify that vehicle, and it's not run on petrol, for instance, in this car example, and you run that car on renewable energy, that CO2 pretty much goes down to zero. And in that case, what we provide to our customer in terms of the embodied carbon of our products becomes much more important. So that's why in October, we decided that our upstream emissions from basically from the mines to when we hand over our products in customer hands should be reduced to zero by the year 2050. This will be earlier in some areas, like in the automotive sector, and customers that are looking for this already in 2040. If you have the time and you're interested, we presented a document on our website, skf.com, which in quite some details explains how you get there, what it looks like in some of our learnings in doing this. I think it can be worth a read. It was quite a lot of work we did prior to COP26, and also to pave the way for when we joined the Science-Based Targets. So if you look at this, and this is also to me important because this is something that all our customers and suppliers are doing or should be doing or will be doing. This is basically the trajectory, the plan of how we will reach 2050. Now, this is as a global company level. It's not a product level. We will get into that. And here you see the scope 1 and 2. That's the lowest part of it, the lowest triangle here. That's our scope 1 and 2 emissions, which we control. And that's where we start working first, and we will reduce that to 0. That's about 20% of our emissions. Then you have the second biggest chunk. It's the direct material, which is typically steel in various ways. That's almost typically like 40% of our emissions. And then we have logistics, and that's about 20%. So those are the 3 main levers. And from a group perspective, we've broken this down into 5-year targets. As was mentioned earlier in our presentation, it's important to be data-driven and have the KPIs. So this is what we are embarking on now. But if you get back to the customer discussion here, I think one fundamental thing when you look at partnering is to understand, even if it's a bit technical in that sense, that we are our customer scope 3. And what does that mean? Well, it means that SKF, for instance, in Kone, when Kone reports their emissions, we are a part of their emissions. We play an important role there. But that also means that we could together look and address that problem. We could look at how can I, in SKF as a supplier to a customer, help out in making their processes more energy efficient? How can I help out in perhaps in the design phase, making a product lighter, making it last longer, making it easier to repair, making it easier to include circular materials, making it easier to dismount or recycle once that's necessary. So I think that's a fundamental step of understanding that this is a common problem we have, and the results that we can create from these kind of partnerships are very important. So what I mentioned earlier is that when we sit down with our customers, we're trying to understand what's their path, what are their key objectives. And here I think it's so important that we are enormously cost efficient together working in this, and that we don't turn into binary measurements. Because at the end of the day, as I mentioned, it's about satellites seeing less emissions. And I also think we will see taxation to a much higher degree in these areas. And at some point, I think we also need to be able to trade in emission reductions to make them as efficiently as possible and cost efficient as possible. So if we look at this, then a typical discussion from our side with the customer would be, how can we work together on logistics? Do we have an inefficient setup? Maybe that's the easiest way and most cost-efficient way of tackle this trajectory in the near term. Is it the direct materials, or is it the SKF operations? In the SKF operations, we already have 3 carbon neutral factories. Maybe we should run through them, or we will increase our investments in certain areas. But as you hear, if you're in the purchasing field, an investment triggers a cost reduction. And here I think it would be so crucial that we have this knowledge and this understanding. For instance, if I would dive into our direct material source, once we get to that point of how can I reduce the embodied carbon of the steel? I can choose different steel suppliers. I could choose different steel routes. I can work with more reused materials such as scrap. But typically, this also has a cost impact. And at the end of the day, once we come further on this trajectory, it will actually mean that many of our steel suppliers will have to do significant investments. And that also will mean that they will come to us and say, well, hey, SKF, if I'm going to do this investment, I need to increase my prices, but I also need commitment that you will stay with me if I do these investments for a period of time. And this is something, of course, that we as SKF will have to take to our customers and say, how do we manage this? Again, we are your scope 3. We are a part of your emission trajectory. So how do we do this efficiently? How do we then enable this trajectory? So how do you do that? I think what we will see is a slight difference in how we set up several of our contracts. I think it will be longer term contracts. We see trends in some areas on increased transparency, where you basically, like in the automotive industry, where you disclose much more of your technological levels, because that will indirectly say what investments that will have to come. I think that there will be an increased use of indexes, because we have a huge volatility now, which makes it very difficult to balance prices. I also think there are some interesting trends in the organization Steel Zero and Responsible Steel, where we are taking part of, that could you source product with a lower embodied carbon in the same way as you're sourcing renewable energy. I.e., as you know, when you source renewable energy, you buy the electricity because electrons don't know if they're produced from coal or from renewables, and then you actually sell the certificate. You allocate the CO2 reduction to a specific product. And you could envisage, for instance, that a company like SKF would go out and say, we buy a certain amount of tons of steel which has lower embodied carbon, and we could allocate that to our customers that need that. I think that makes sense, because it would create a stronger buying power, which would send a signal to the steel manufacturer, which is good. But I think I talk generically on from the company point of view. When we work with our customers, we're down at the product point of view. And here's a bearing for a car wheel end. And typically what we do then is that we break it down. What are the emissions related to the raw material? What are the emissions related to various parts of the supply chain and the parts that we produce? And then we very clearly can see on what areas we have to address. And this is typically something we do with our customers, again, to create this transparency, to create this common journey together, and partner on getting these solutions in place. So I think to sum it up a little bit, I think we're seeing a clear strategic shift that we must be aware of, that it is fundamental. We're not chasing carbon for a couple of years, we're doing it forever. And I think we have to get your companies and business into pole position as quickly as possible. I think it's fundamental to have this knowledge of the life cycle approach, where you start thinking about, even in your design phase, design for circularity. And this you will have to do with your partners to get the best knowledge. I think we will see an increase in data sharing with partners. I think that's necessary to get to net zero as cost efficiently as possible, but also to produce and understand the full value chain. For instance, if we produce a bearing which is in a critical application, we try to protect that with our seals and lubricants, of course, so it should run as long as possible. But we're also adding digital solutions and sensors, so we can ideally pick the bearing out once we see that it's starting to be degrading, so we can repair it. We call that remanufacturing and put it back in operation. You could imagine that you could give that bearing then a second life in a less critical application somewhere else. But of course, that triggers a lot more of standardization and also what we call bearing passports, that you have to have a knowledge of the life of the particular product. And then finally, as I touched upon, I think the bridging of the cost in the supply chain will be paramount to trigger the investments all the way up. Because typically, if you look at steel again, and this was also mentioned by Kone, we are a fairly small buyer, but if we could send this signal together, things will happen. And to end, that's also the primary reason why we have joined, for instance, an organization that's called Steel Zero, where we commit basically to buy low embodied carbon steel once it's there. And that's to send the signal to the market that this is something that we need to partner with our customers to make it happen. And I believe it can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you the same question or a similar question like before. So you at the beginning mentioned impact of the war, but I would like to ask more specifically if you think it may in some way accelerate even the efforts to increase sustainability and to improve whole supply chains in the way that they are more sustainable. I mean now, for example, that there may be a push from European Union and other Western countries, even stronger push to promote green technologies, to somehow lessen in more rapid way our dependency on fossil fuels that are especially in the case of Eastern Europe from Russia. So do you think that there may be even stronger push forward for these green technologies and for sustainability in general, even in your company?
I think we picked up fairly clear signals that there's quite a lot on the European level. I mean, it's individually different in country to country, but there's so much that can be done just on energy efficiency. If you look at Europe's climate target, I mean, I might be wrong, but I think it was up like 45% of that would be reached through energy efficiency measures. What I've been picking up reading a bit is that I think it would be an enormous acceleration of introducing renewable and other energy sources than gas, and of course that's triggered then, as I understand, you know, from Europe's exposure towards Russia in this case.
So thank you very much for your answer. And what do you think will be the development of your company in the next few years regarding the high energy prices? Are you affected by it, and in to what extent do you think it may somehow hinder your development? Because I think this major inflationary shock, I think, is something that was not expected even 2 or 3 weeks ago. And now, for example, new numbers here in the Czech Republic are really shocking. We have had inflation over 11%, and we are maybe approaching to inflation of 15%. So how this inflationary pressures affect your business, SKF AB business?
I think it affects us as all industries. I mean, we source a lot of material which requires a lot of energy to produce. So I think we're seeing exactly the same thing as you're describing here. That energy prices are going up. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market. So I think it would be. I mean, we have a lot of good energy efficiency programs, and I think it will just encourage everyone to work even harder on that. I saw some cases on we were simulating what energy efficiency projects to prioritize. I mean, and of course, with these prices, the return of investments on those calculations changes dramatically. So I think there will be an enormous drive for energy efficiency everywhere, basically, because it's such a cost saving.
Mm-hmm. So we may see another positive development coming from negative wave of events from the war, from the inflation. So it may be something which is quite positive concerning the future development. Thank you very much, Johan.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.